come from a background, something next screen, continue. We come from a background which I'm sure is not exactly alien to most of you. Tight budgets, cuts to pre-sessionals, and a significant number of students, about 45% in our case, transitioning to higher education with limited academic literacies and equally limited language skills. When they get to universities, our learners, quite rightly, want to study the major they signed up for. The administration also wants them to study the major they signed up for, and even we want them to study the major they signed up for. However, those academic language and literacy gaps need to be addressed first if the students are to succeed. Please for help already. It's only the first slide. Given the unequal spread across the majors, this can only be done on a course given to all. However, as you know, each discipline constructs its discourse in its own way. How then can we put a square peg in a round hole? We are Jaime Buchanan, fresh from Nova Scotia in Canada, and Tony Myers, really not fresh at all. And our talk is called ESAP-in-EGAP, Implementing Sydney School Genre Pedagogy in Gulf Higher Education. And that's a bit of a clue as to what we did. So what was the challenge? Well, several years ago, we were told that the pre-sessional we worked on was being reduced from 2 years to 1 semester. Furthermore, it was decided it would become a non-credit bearing conditional in-sessional, reduced from 20 to 15 hours a week, but taken alongside credit bearing courses. On top of that, the 5 separate colleges in the majors were all demanding that we furnish them with students more adequate to the task of completing their majors on time. This presentation will show how our department attempted to navigate the rock of a 75% reduction in course time and the hard place of an increased demand for relevancy to the subjects students were going to study. It seeks to answer the question then, how can we give a pre-sessional to students for all courses which prepares them specifically for theirs? One source of inspiration for this comes from the models of learning we had studied long ago in our deltas. Jaime will now travel through the mists of time to explain the theory.
Thank you for that, Tony. So we did turn to theory, as Tony just mentioned. In particular, we looked at theories of language acquisition, or how children learn to speak their native language. So when we learn to speak, we don't do so in isolation. Children develop speech through meaningful interactions with an expert speaker who is usually a caregiver, hence the term mother language. Research by Claire Painter and Michael Halliday, among others, demonstrates how this occurs through careful negotiation of meaning. Similarly, we also looked at theories of language acquisition, second language acquisition, and there are many similarities. So for example, if you look at the acquisition of the discrete grammatical morphemes in English, it follows the same trajectory, whether it is your primary language or, whether it's your native language or whether you're learning to speak English as an additional language. We also see that the evidence suggests that learning occurs best when it is centered on practicing your resource within the context, within meaningful contexts. So we have Vygotsky with his zone of proximal development, and we talk about things like project or problem-based learning and communicative language teaching. So it's always like talking around language, and there's meaning is always at the center. So finally, we turn to theories about how people best learn to read. Once again, the research indicates that reading skills are best developed with careful structuring and guidance in a very supporting environment. And this is something I'm very familiar with right now. I have twins who are 6.5, and they're in this process. They're learning to read. And you can see there's a very deliberate, very careful and structured progression that happens. So, they start with the alphabet, and then they have the phonemes, and then graded readers with, language patterns, careful repetition, a lot of extra textual clues such as pictures, and those supports are gradually removed or abstracted as the literacy skill develops. One thing that's really key to note is when children learn to read in their primary language, there's a lot of talking about as well as around a text when they're learning to read. So there's always a lot of meta language involved. And so based on these three areas that we looked at and the theories that we reviewed, we were very much attracted to the Sydney School genre pedagogy. First and foremost, because it's founded on systemic functional linguistics. So the idea that language cannot be divorced from meaning, it is semiotic a priori. So these principles derive from how we learn to speak, and it is also a practical application of how we learn to read. Indeed, Rothery, one of the researchers from University of Sydney, she developed the teaching and learning cycle that is at the basis of the Sydney School genre pedagogy. She suggested that we needed to make learning to read more the same process of learning to speak. And of course, in ways it was until the rise of progressivism in the 1980s that was seeking to put students in control of their learning. Tony's now going to give you a bit of information about our context.
Thank you, Jamie. So yeah, part of our attraction to Sydney School genre pedagogy came also from an understanding of our variegated student body. As learners, they face a number of challenges as they enter higher education. Firstly, in the UAE, higher education takes place almost exclusively in an EMI environment, English as a medium of instruction. And for most of 95% of them, I would say their first language is Arabic. So that's immediately an issue for them. Secondly, and crucially exacerbated by this, are the differing levels of exposure our students have to reading in the domestic sphere. The average Emirati spends 51 hours a year reading, which compares to, for example, the average Indian who spends 536 hours reading, but that is an average. Next, we have 5 disparate colleges, technology, business, art, for example, and they have very little in the way of commonality in assignments. When as a department, we mapped the curricula of the colleges, we had almost a full house of Nessie and Gardner bingo when we had 12 out of the 13 genres in use. And those genres were not used in any sense of progression either. And finally, perhaps the most crucial difference is that our students have had unequal access to Western teaching approaches. And this really plays into the sense of social justice with Sydney School genre pedagogy. Because while a minority have enjoyed private education with student-centered teaching of the kind found in Western schools, the majority went and still go to state schools where more directed learning is the norm, and the teacher is very much center of the learning experience. It was our strong hunch then that students in our context, and potentially some of your own also, are already accustomed to, expect, and even possibly may prefer a class that is guided through a strong tutor presence. Given these factors, the choice of teaching approach seemed ever more in favor of Sydney School genre pedagogy. Jamie now picks up the story of how this was applied. Jamie.
Thank you. All right. So remember, we were seeking to create a specific academic literacy preparation course that could then be applied to all students, regardless of those very different disciplines that Tony just mentioned. So we chose to resolve this problem by teaching not genre, but genre literacy. So this involved a two-pronged approach. First, we taught students to notice elements of a text, raising awareness of aspects like their purpose, the intended reader, the relationship between the reader and the writer, the text organization, as well as linguistic features at the clause level. We then, the second prong, taught students to ask key questions that would unlock the salient features of any future assignment or task. So it was literacy as opposed to just genre or text type. We also wanted to give our students the best chance of success. So bearing in mind all of those constraints and parameters that Tony just mentioned, things like the one semester course, we wanted to base our course on principles that were really going to maximize their chance of success. So again, going back to that whole social justice and the democratizing and equality of access to education. So to do this, we designed the course to move from familiar to less familiar or unfamiliar genres. Our course begins with a review of email, which is a very familiar genre for everyone. It also demonstrates those key features I mentioned. Eventually, the course progresses through less familiar genres such as explanation. This, of course, meant that we were also moving from simpler to more complex texts and simpler to more complex language across the various strata. Finally, we provided very strong support, strong scaffolding, and guidance at the initial points of each module. And these supports were gradually removed as students became more confident and as their linguistic resource was developed. Okay, in terms of learning activities, we began by starting with these noticing and raising learner awareness of the text type. Learners analyzed and deconstructed successful model texts. Then they helped to co-construct a text through the guidance of the tutor. This helped to develop their linguistic resource as well as their confidence before they were then expected to independently create or produce a text for assessment purposes. I hope that you would agree with me that that is, perhaps a fair assessment in terms of validity and fairness. We really hope that this scaffolded learning would increase learner confidence and it would avoid some of the fossilization that we had seen in our context of too many years of teaching the persuasive essay writing, or the process of essay, sorry. We really wanted to contribute to producing autonomous learners, students who would be able to develop and take these skills to their future studies. And in order to do this, we needed to get students thinking differently about language. We needed to discuss language differently, and so that necessitated a new shared meta language. So for example, instead of talking about discrete language items, particularly in terms of parts of speech, we talked about language in more functional terms, such as participants and processes, and that enables a different way of thinking about language. In the same way, discussing phases of a text as opposed to paragraphs helps to free the learner from those fossilized restraints I was mentioning earlier, when perhaps the essay has been taught, in isolation. But we also needed a new means of not just talking about language with students, but talking about classroom practices. So remember, this is talking about pedagogy. So this led to a new shared pedagogic meta-language with the course tutors. So we needed tutors to understand classroom activities within a new context. So understanding the purpose, the role, the importance of things like field building, why we deconstruct a text, why joint construction that is guided by the expert is so vital. And we needed tutors to understand this according to their functional purposes within the teaching and learning context. So now Tony is going to give you our evaluation of the course that we developed.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, so first of all, what were the challenges? Well, central to this approach were us, teachers. For many of us, it was a radical shift to move to more directed learning, and this was very unintuitive. And I think most notably, this affected joint deconstruction, that part of Rothery's teaching learning cycle, where the temptations of communicative language teaching were strongest, and meant that the expert now has sometimes delegated this role to group work. Another point is that those of us trained and experienced in teaching a structural syllabus also took some time to adjust to not focusing on bottom-up language as opposed to the top-down approach. And this was exacerbated by compliance requirements from our accrediting body for our assessments, which led to an increased emphasis on lexicogrammar at the clause level. Another point was that this is a mastery approach to learning, and there is and was some discomfort with the idea of everybody succeeding. It's as Jamie was talking about, it's crucial to the Sydney School pedagogical approach that everybody has equal access to learning, and therefore equal access to the same levels of attainment. But we are used to bell curves of attainment, and every teacher and every course has to be aware of their grade distribution, and that's built into the system. So that's some of the challenges. And on top of that, of course, the one that everybody's familiar with and everybody loves, COVID. Emergency remote teaching kicked in to the second semester, sorry, and the associated affected stresses of living and trying to learn through a pandemic inhibited more extensive engagement with Sydney School genre pedagogy, as everyone struggled to adapt to online learning. Those were the challenges. But did it work? Well, yes. The first positive was that teachers reported that students produced high quality work. Students on the course were also highly engaged and appeared motivated by the fact that the course focused on real writing of a kind they would likely need to reproduce in their chosen courses. And as a result, the course had high face validity for the students. Secondly, despite early worries that the course might be too demanding for first semester undergraduates, it was felt that a majority of learners had met the learning outcomes. Indeed, in the first semester, I think some 85% of students passed the course. Many teachers we spoke to felt that adopting the teaching learning cycle and heavily front-loading the teaching with a prepare, not repair model, scaffolding learners' engagement with the target structures was seen as a very effective way to help them meet their learning outcomes. So that's a big win there, I think. Thirdly, the perhaps more controversial aspect, the engagement with the teacher-led work was very clear. In conversations with students, they revealed that they felt relaxed and confident in the teacher's expertise and guidance, and that they weren't worrying if they were in fact learning whatever it was that they were supposed to be learning, which is sometimes something that happens. Fourthly, and unexpectedly, a key benefit of the course was the fact that extensive scaffolding had a significant impact on cheating and plagiarism. By the time students came to submit their assignments, they felt confident enough to submit their own writing without undue external assistance. And I'm pretty sure this course had the lowest level of plagiarism incidents across the university. And I think fifthly, the key to all of this was the development of the students' genre literacy. As one student noted in an end of semester reflection, let me quote, "As a next step, I will try to ask my instructor to give us a clear idea about my assignments, such as key points that I should include in my assignment to achieve the purpose of writing while I write different types of module." And that goes back to the two-pronged approach that Jamie was talking about earlier. On the one hand, this student is now fully versed in the fact that there are genres and they're different from each other. And she's also versed in the fact that she has the questions to ask of any genre she meets now, such as what is the purpose of this? And what kinds of things do I need to, what kind of linguistic resources do I need to use to actuate them? And in that sense, even though the course is more directed, more teacher focused, it does develop student and learner autonomy. Thank you for listening. I'd say any questions, they will come later. There's our references. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony and Jamie. As we said at the beginning, we're going to go do the two talks and the questions after. But there's some questions coming in, a couple of questions coming in the chat for you there now. So the next talk is, I was going to put the title in the chat. But I don't need to. It's Dr. Jennifer McDonald from Canada, Beyond English Only. Jennifer, I'll just pass over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carol, and thanks, Tony and Jamie, for that really, really interesting talk. We're going to travel from the UAE now to Canada and talk about English only and EAP program language policy. So first, let's talk about what I mean by English only and English only policies. What I'm talking about are these policies that are quite commonplace, at least in Canadian ELT and EAP. So 3 strikes, you're out if you're heard speaking a language other than English in the classroom, or where points of some sort, participation points, are given or taken away for the use of English or the use of other languages in the classroom. I would love to hear in the chat from you if where you are, if English only policies are commonplace or not. Like I was saying, in Canada, they are. So what I'm going to talk about today is moving beyond English only. So I'll first start by talking a little bit about some of the motivations for and the challenges around English only language policies and EAP programs in Canada. I'll share a little bit of the research around monolingual, bi and multi-plurilingual approaches to language policy in Canada. And then I'll share a case study from a Canadian EAP center around policy change, instructor-led policy change from an English-only policy to a classroom language policy that embraces multi and plurilingual approaches to the classroom. Okay, I'm seeing in the chat here, so China, maybe their English-only policies are popular. Okay, let me see, Japan, we have Scotland, the UK, and this will be really interesting to hear as I talk to you about the change in a Canadian center. Some of you have been mentioning in the chat here changes in your context, so this will be really great to hear from you about. Okay. So first, here's another question for you. In contexts where there is an English-only policy, what is ostensibly the main goal? Why are these policies put into place? Put it in the chat. What is it? You know, very generally speaking here, of course. What is the main goal of an English-only policy? Why are these put into place? Anyone? Yes, BK, to encourage users, to encourage learners to use more English, attempt at immersion, and to encourage use of the target language. Exactly. So this is ostensibly the main goal of English-only policies. Now, for those of us that have taught and learned in context with an English-only policy, what is usually the biggest shortcomings of an English-only policy? What might it be, the biggest challenge? Okay, I see punitive, I see confusion. Yes, and we'll talk about this in a minute. Greg, inefficient. That just, once again, very generally speaking, is a huge challenge of English-only policies. They don't tend to be very effective at encouraging and promoting target language use in the classroom. I see all kinds of other reasons as well, all kinds of other shortcomings around proficiency, them being confusing, etc. And we'll talk about those in a second. But really, they're not very effective. Okay, so let's take now the world's quickest overview of monolingual and multi-plurilingual approaches in the classroom. If we look back to even the end of the 19th century, we can see this monolingual assumption start to become present in English language teaching in different contexts. And this assumption is one where interaction with the native speaker, a monolingual native speaker of English, is seen as the ideal goal. It's the ideal, a monolingual speaker of English is the ideal interlocutor. It's the monolingual use of English is the ideal way for languages to be taught and learned. And another way of framing this and describing this is these are monolingual ideologies or discourses. Now, Don't worry, I'm not going to take us down a Foucauldian rabbit hole here talking about discourses, but I'm going to refer to ideologies and discourses as these really pervasive ideas around languages, how they're best taught, how they're best learned, and how they're best used. And these ideas that underlie and infuse and influence everything from learners' attitudes to teachers, how they approach language teaching, to the public, to parents, to administrators, and their views on language. And a lot of the time, these ideologies and these discourses, they're there, and we're enacting them without really knowing it. So this monolingual assumption, these monolingual ideologies have been present for quite a while in ELT more generally. The communicative approach to language teaching is underpinned in its purest form by a monolingual ideology. Now, as we get into the 90s, for example, bilingual and multilingual approaches in the ELT classroom start to become more common. A judicious approach to the use of the own language in the classroom can facilitate learning. We start to see translation as the fifth skill. Code switching and other forms of plurilingual activity start to become valued, and we start to see them in different teaching contexts. And there's an acknowledgement of changing contexts of use of English. So it's no longer necessarily the case that we think that a native speaker is the ideal interlocutor, and that's why we're using English. I just want to recommend Holland Cook's state-of-the-art article that I've cited here on the screen is a really nice, accessible overview to the evolution of a monolingual approach in ELT. Okay, so then we get to the 2017 companion volume to the CEFR, where we see plurilingual and pluricultural approaches incorporated into the CEFR. So it's becoming something that is seen as increasing effectiveness, value, and centrality in language teaching. Like I said, world's fastest overview ever. But this brings us to the Canadian research in EAP, right? This what I've just presented here, we're looking at ELT as a whole. So let's focus even a bit closer in on Canada. Here's a handful of recent research from Canada into multi and plurilingual approaches to language teaching in the EAP context. There's definitely a movement within Canada away from monolingual approaches and starting to investigate how we can bring students' other languages into the classroom, how we can tap into students' language repertoires to maximize learning, as well as have a positive effect on other things such as identity, etc. And just to shout out some of my Canadian colleagues here, there's really, really interesting research happening in Canada in and around EAP, and the TESOL Canada Journal, an open access journal, is a great place to start if anyone is interested in delving a little bit into this, a little bit more into this. Okay, so the zeitgeist, things in Canada are moving away from a strictly English only or monolingual approach in the classroom towards plurilingual and multilingual environments. Now, This collection of Canadian research into plurilingual approaches in EAP, they highlight a couple of different benefits to a plurilingual approach. And the first of which is, and as several of you have mentioned in the chat's blowing up here. I can't wait to delve into some of your questions and comments at the end. So the first thing is that whereas English only policies, especially of the like red card or 3 strikes you're out variety that has been commonplace in Canadian ELT, those are punitive. And whereas plurilingual approaches can reverse these negative associations with the L1, and they substitute a carrot for the stick. They can try to encourage target language use rather than punishing other language use. They also reverse some of these deficit discourses. So in an English only context, the L1 is framed as a deficit. It's not about all the languages I know and I'm adding English to it. It's about my deficit in English that I have to reverse. So a plurilingual approach and plurilingual policies can help turn this on its head and to view language learning as something additive rather than through a deficit framing. What else? The students or learners' other languages are a huge, huge, huge learning resource and can be tapped into to enhance learning, to make learning more effective. Not only learning of language and learning of English, but also content. I know so many of us here at the conference are involved in EMI, in CLIL contexts, and teach or content-based language instruction. So the L1 is a huge resource for this as well. And then finally, and this is a really important one for Canadian EAP practitioners, a plurilingual approach much better represents the linguistic diversity of Canada and our universities. So the most recent census, well, the 2016 census in Canada reports that 20% of Canadians speak a language other than the official languages, English and French, at home. And in some centers, especially the larger metropolitan centers like Toronto or Vancouver, that figure can approach 50%. So there's a very high level of linguistic diversity in Canada and in our universities as well. You know, universities in Canada may have from anywhere from 15 to, in some cases, more than 50% international students who bring with them, of course, a range of languages and linguistic backgrounds. And so an English-only approach and also this positioning of a monolingual English teacher or speaker as the ideal interlocutor, teacher, and the ideal communicative setting, it's just not the reality in Canada today. Okay, so moving now from language, the different approaches to language policy to the classroom, I wanted to just mention the role of the practitioner, the teacher, the EAP teacher in language policy, program language policy, and these different pedagogical approaches. So Risotto and Hornberger conjure up this image of an onion, and think they talk to us about language policy as this onion, right? So and what they mean by that is when we talk about language policy, we can have the outer layers of the onion. We can have policies that might come from the government. They might come from ministries of education. They might come from institutions, for example. And so we have these layers, the government, different institutions. We could have different program level policies on layers of this onion. And then at the very center, we have at the heart of this, we have the practitioner. The practitioner can make or break implementation of different language policies. Why? They're the ones who put it into place. They're the ones who can, who enact different policies in the classroom with their learners, and they decide how it's used, how they enact it, how it's enforced. Also, so in this way, practitioners have this huge role to play in shaping the language ideologies or discourses that can be associated with different language policies. So they're really at the heart of all of this. Okay, so let's look at a case study, shall we? This is a case study from a Canadian EAP center, quite a small center. At the time, this center had around 18 EAP instructors, as well as an academic manager. Instructors, a teaching core that reflects the diversity of Canada, several instructors identifying as non-native speakers of English or plurilingual. And this program had an English-only policy. So this English-only policy specified that English only was to be used in class. This policy appeared on course outlines or syllabus, in student handbooks, and it also formed a central part of orientation activities at this center. This center at the time had a large percentage of students who shared the same first language, and many instructors reported frustration despite the existence of an English-only policy. They reported frustration with the use of English in the classroom. So there was a lot, despite having an English-only policy, there was a lot of non-English only activity and interaction happening in the classroom. So what happened? Okay, so this, as I've been saying, this was really an instructor-led and instructor-shaped policy change. In July of 2017, the academic manager brought the issue up in an all-staff session and proposed it as a kind of experiment. So the issues around monolingual approaches, plurilingual approaches, the shortcomings of an English-only policy, those were discussed, and the staff decided to embark upon an experiment to question, to reapproach this English-only policy. And so how it worked was everyone was in a room. There were small groups, each group with a laptop, and there was co-editing and co-creation of new policy text. So the old policy was there, and in groups, in shared documents, new text was created, a new kind of vision for this language program policy was expressed and was co-created and shaped. Now, at the same time, knowing that any policy for most successful implementation, it has to be accompanied by resources, both for instructors as well as students. So also created at this time was a bank of resources, lessons, handouts, discussion topics, etc., around this new classroom language policy. So moving from an English-only policy to a classroom language policy. Then over basically the next year, the staff checked in on this policy, contributed suggestions, change, and feedback around it, contributed more resources for the resource pack. So the implementation was was kind of gradual and really a two-way street as people fed back about the policy. Now, what did the policy text include? It included a couple of things. One area that the text included was around the benefits of speaking English in class, and so the benefits of target language use. And then, as well, this policy text guided students toward developing the skill of plurilingual competence and mediation, and also firmly positioned the responsibility for language and languages use in the classroom with the students. So rather than having it sit with the teacher as something to police or enforce, then it's something that's sat with the student. There was also, as I mentioned, a kit, a pack of resources that went along with it. Okay, now I'll just go quickly over some of the issues and challenges so we can get to questions about both this session as well as the previous one. The first is around the fact that plurilingual competence is a skill set. And so especially for students coming from environments that are monolingual environments or environments where they've only been exposed to monolingual teaching and learning approaches, the ability to draw on and to use the other languages in students' repertoires for learning, that's not something that people necessarily know how to do. So that's something that had to be taught. And as a result, it had to be, there was some curricular change that accompanied this policy change. Student response, as has been mentioned in the chat, some students were hesitant about a plurilingual and multilingual approach in the classroom because they had been very used to monolingual approaches. Similarly with instructors. Some instructors had been very used to approaching things through a monolingual lens in their teaching practice. So there was some instructor training that accompanied it as well. And finally, on the online environment presents new challenges and new dimensions of a classroom language use policy. And so those are being explored at this center right now. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can delve into some questions. Like I said, for